Good morning. We are here in Fondazione Enrico Mattei, also this year. And this year we are planning this series. The name of this series is Keywords of the World. The keyword today is the distribution, but also related to the open economy and so what's happening today in US in the world. We have a pleasure to have here Professor Mike Spence, Nobel Prize 2001, again also this year, because each year we met each other in order to have some update of what's happening in the world. And so we can start. Thank you very much for being here.
Sergio, great to be here.
Thank you very much. So I start with a most important question today. So what happened in the last month with the election of Donald Trump, with this idea of the Liberation Day, with the tariffs, which could be the effect in the global economy, US economy. So I started with two things. So the introduction is related to one article that you have written on Project Syndicate, which you write each 3 months. So there is a periodic articles. The title is Navigating the Trump Storm. I think is the right title. And I link also on other things. So there is a paper, a book that is published by Rogoff. The title is Our Dollar, Your Problem. So the title is important. And the conclusion that is inside is if runaway US debt policy continues to crash up against higher real interest rate and geopolitical instability, and if political pressures constrain the Federal Reserve's ability to consistently tame inflation, it will be everyone's problem. I would like to know which is your comment about these two things.
Well, first of all, I think there's general agreement. Certainly, I agree that the current trajectory of the United States debt is unsustainable. So that doesn't mean we know when it will crash. But if you're in an environment in which real interest rates are either rising or just plain high, then the mindsets that went with a long period of very low interest rates, which placed relatively few constraints on rising debt levels, not in the United States but globally, then you have a mindset that's not suited to where we're going now. And so if you start with the unsustainability, then you have the Trump shock, uncertainty about the trajectory of tariffs. Our central bank, it's called the Federal Reserve, holding back, with uncertainty about the trajectory of inflation, which is one of their two main mandates, and the possibility that we'll have an extended period of higher real interest rates, which I think was the trajectory we were on before, but that's a slightly controversial proposition. Then you could easily get a situation in which, the bond markets all of a sudden, develop, problems. And so, to make it very specific, right after the Liberation Day tariffs were announced, this is not widely known, the United States Treasury market, which is by far the biggest bond market in the world, by far, started to become illiquid, came that close. And I think it was that, more than the resistance inside the United States from the corporate sector and, and consumers, because we had corporate sector declining, investment plans, consumer confidence going down, the prospect of, empty ships, not arriving in ports, etc. I think it was the bond market that scared them and produced the 90-day postponement. Now, that doesn't resolve the uncertainty. So my view is Rogoff's right. This is not... there are various versions of how it's going to end, but an eruption in the bond markets, in the sovereign bond markets, is a good starting place. And if it really is serious, that's a cataclysmic event. I mean, because people hold those bonds all over the world. They're major parts of reserves in most countries that have reserves. If you have an illiquidity event, then you start to get collateral calls and the dominoes start falling, through various entities that are holding them. It really is potentially extraordinarily dangerous. Now, we didn't get there this time. This is analogous, by the way, in at the start of the great financial crisis, the American side of it, not the sovereign debt one here, the payment system almost froze up and required a massive intervention on the part of the Federal Reserve to prevent, basically financial institutions going broke because they wouldn't honor each other's assets and liabilities, which cross over overnight in the American system. And so this is just plain, what I call playing with fire. And so we have to find a way, both domestically in the United States and globally, to get on a different track. And I think there's general agreement on that. You can't cut taxes and leave spending in its current levels and expect, to be able to do that on a sustainable basis. Now, what's the altered course we're going to take? Nobody knows. Probably a good guess in the Trump administration is they'll try to find ways to cut various parts of the federal expenditure when they're already doing it with, trimming down the federal government, even though that doesn't look like so far it's been very successful. And then there's knock-on effects of that. We can talk about them, but I think that would be the direction of movement under a Trump administration. But this is a long-term problem.
Yeah, thank you. What about the possibility to have another currency, so another reserve currency? So there is started some years ago, probably, the idea to have another currency on the east part, so Asian part. There is this possibility. So I have in mind some articles that I read on the Financial Times and so on, in which they are discussing about also something that is in 1971 when U.S. so Nixon said that the U.S. was out of a Bretton Woods. Was similar to that.
Yeah. So I mean, if there were an alternative, a real alternative at this moment, then the title of Rogoff's book would be wrong. The reason it's our currency and your problem is that there's no alternative at the moment to the dollar, and so the dollar has already been tarnished because of the use of sanctions and in the international payment system. The United States has used its influence in those areas to pursue various objectives that aren't strictly economic. The sanctions related to the Ukraine war would be an example. So that the dollar is a less attractive reserve currency than it used to be, and you can imagine a scenario in which it becomes increasingly unattractive. I would say if that were to happen, Sergio, we would be in a world that didn't really have a viable reserve currency. So why is it the only option now? I mean, first of all, you need a very big economy, because a reserve currency has to have an open capital account, which means money flows in and out of it. And if you have a small economy and a relatively small financial system, those inflows and outflows will produce excess destabilizing volatility. So what are the candidates? Well, China has big enough economy and big enough financial bond markets, but they thus far have not opened the capital account, right?
Yeah.
So, and probably that's wise policy on the part of the Chinese. So over time, they could get there. A second alternative would be Europe. But for that to occur, the European bond market would have to be the European bond market, not the Italian bond market, the German bond market, the French bond market. And so far, even though we're expanding, relaxing fiscal constraints and expanding expenditure on things like defense in response to the perception, I think correct perception, that the United States, at least for now, has become an unpredictable and unreliable ally. Not only and trading partner, not only in economics but in defense and security. So that's a perfectly sensible way to go. One way to do that would be to do it collectively and expand the kind of central fiscal structure in the European Union. And if that were to happen, then the euro would be a viable candidate for being a reserve currency. It already is in a sense, but it has these limits, associated with the divisions in the sovereign debt market. And then there's a few other currencies that are significant. the Japanese currency, but probably isn't a candidate. And then the only other thing is, some version of a basket of currencies. So you have the SDRs at the IMF, and I think there's speculation about that, but thus far, I guess if we're going to go down that route, then you have to have pretty stable and widely supported international institutions that are the equivalent of the central bank for one of those things. And that's not where we are now. Maybe we could get there with a powered up IMF with the responsibility for managing some version of an international currency like that. So that's why I think, Rogoth's right. At the moment, we're stuck with a tarnished version of the only really viable reserve currency. But over time, especially if we stay on the present course, the attractiveness of the dollar will be diminished. And what he means by everybody's problem is a world that doesn't have a stable, reliable, relatively safe asset is a very different world than the world that we've lived in for most of the post-war period. So that this become everybody's problem.
Okay. It's about this. You have also written an article related to Europe needs of a new economic vision. So this is the title of your article. I'm thinking also that we could have a change of the geopolitical equilibrium if we change the currency, no? If this happened also in the past. So in the past we had, before dollar, we had also the currency of UK. So
that's
the British
right. The UK
pound
was the dominant currency for many years.
Until First World War. Okay, so the point is also now I move inside Europe. So looking at which could be the idea of which could be this kind of new economic vision. Part of this you have a summary now. And inside also there is the Germany that has an economy that is not going very well, even if there is a possibility that is the opposite of US. No? So US at the moment has 120% of GDP, debt over GDP. That is more or less the same percentage we had in Italy during the crisis of 2011, but obviously we are speaking about two different countries, two different effects.
Right.
But it's a huge amount. Also, the public debt in US is very high, is more or less 25% of the total GDP of the world. And on the other side, Germany is more or less higher than 62-63% of debt over GDP. So in this case, there is a possibility to expand the economy to increase. And which could be your opinion about? Again, I take the title of your article is "What's Wrong with the German Economy?" and also if you link also this idea that they can use also the debt in order to push economy.
So let me answer that, sort of indirectly by starting with Europe, and I'll get to Germany. So I basically agree with, having lived here for 20 years now. I'm not a European citizen. I don't know as much as those of you who live here. But I probably have a better sense than, most people who drift in and out. And I think that various reports, including the Enrico Letta report and the Mario Draghi report, are basically directionally right. I mean, you can quibble about bits and pieces of it.
Yeah.
But we need higher growth. We need greater resilience. We need to leverage the very, very large size of the European economy better, meaning take away the remaining barriers, regulatory, services, We need to centrally fund, the core basic, research and applied research in science and technology, because that's the only way to do it efficiently, right? I mean, what Europe does now, this is an exaggeration, but it's basically right. If we did what Europe's doing now in this area, and this is long term, right? I mean, we're not talking about fixing things tomorrow. With this, it's just longer term. This kind of drives human capital. It drives technological sophistication. It affects digital, where you are vis-a-vis the major players. That directly affects your ability to transform structurally, which is a crucial element of sustaining long-term growth. All of those things, I think, are directionally right. And I think, there is at least some chance that the shock delivered from the United States side will overcome some inertia, let me put it that way, and produce some movement in that direction in Europe. You can see it already happening in defense, and to some extent. There are bits and pieces. So, for example, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, issued essentially an open invitation, along with a big fund, to academics in the United States to come and do their work here. Well, it's a very smart thing to do. And I can testify, as somebody who hangs around various universities, including Bocconi, that CVs are starting to arrive. And it's not just a trickle, right? So what's going on in the United States, the flip side of this coin, is one of the more worrying things that's going on, that I put under the heading of potential long-term effects, which is the threat, well, both the reality and the threat to funding of basic science and applied science and technology in the United States, which is done mostly at the federal government level. And the Trump administration is, because of their dislike of various features of universities, is threatening their funding. This would be, most people would agree who thought about it, would be a core pillar of sort of long-term economic performance in the United States. It's not the only one, but it's a pretty important one. And to do this at a time when you have sort of massive potential breakthroughs in various fields of science, but biomedical, life sciences, which is the biggest part of our research funding, but in the digital area, the application of AI, in the sciences, and not to mention the economy, and so on. So it's a good time for Europe to issue an invitation. And it's sort of vaguely reminiscent of what happened before World War II, where, because of the developments in Europe, the United States benefited from a very large inflow of the absolutely top, or a subset of the absolutely top scientists. And at that time, the United States was noticeably, measurably behind Europe in its scientific research capabilities. So that migration produced an enormous, step forward for the United States and underpinned the early post-war blossoming of the science and research enterprise in the United States. It's not a perfect analogy because Europe's got a ton of scientific talent, so the gap is not very big between the United States and Europe now. Europe mostly is held back by funding, restrictions that cause people, including many Europeans, to migrate across the Atlantic to do their research. And now, of course, many of them are going to migrate back, because everybody would rather do their work at home. If it's the best place to do it, that's great. So I'm happy for Europe, but I think that's part of the picture that we're looking at as we look forward. So to turn to Germany very sort of briefly, I think everybody in Europe faces the sets of obstacles we just talked about. These reforms are important if you want to get full potential. Second, in the post-pandemic period, Europe has just more headwinds. It's not Europe's fault, right? The Ukraine war, energy prices, fragmentation of global trading networks, supply networks, etc., have not helped Europe. And especially Germany, because it is externally exposed as an economy, both within Europe but outside Europe, and especially to China. And China has its own problems because they have a deficiency in aggregate demand, and in order to fix it, they have to change the composition of aggregate demand away from investment toward consumption, away from exports toward, various domestic expenditures. The investment levels they've lived on for a long time are way too high for the current environment. And that sounds simple, right? And then actually changing the demand side would be simple. The problem is that if you change the demand side significantly, the supply side has to keep up with it, right? I mean, this is not a world in which you can buy all those things externally. I mean, China is a big, high middle income economy with a huge domestic market, lots of non-tradable sectors, etc. And if you switch everything over from government-driven investment to consumption, right, the supply side has to switch from everything they did to support investment to things that households in China want to buy. You can't do that overnight. I mean, structural change is generally poorly understood, but one of the most important things is it takes time. So that's kind of the picture, and I don't think anybody should write off the German economy at this point. But I think the worrying thing is that the deficit in digital, the shortage of software engineers, and the importance of all of that on a longer term time horizon, Sergio, for changing the structure of the economy. I don't think Germany needs to become less industrial, but it has to become digitally enabled industrial. And that right now it doesn't have the resources, and part of that's a German problem and part of that's a European problem. So we don't have a domestically resident huge cloud computing system. It's harder for us to train the models that require massive computer resources. I mean, we do have big computers in what you call CERN and Leonardo, but it's not clear we use them for these purposes. Again, this can change, but I think that directionally it's question marks. The more serious problem in Germany is question marks of whether they have all the pieces that will enable the kind of structural change that makes the economy as powerful as it was, in earlier periods, say after 2000 and the shorter reforms. And I think it's an open question. But right now, both in Germany and generally in Europe, the standard measures of economic performance like growth are below where they could be, right? Suboptimal. And so that we just need to move in that direction. And a lot of related things that have to do with distribution are easier to solve if you're sort of growing more rapidly. Some of the distributional things that Europe has, that we have in a more extreme form in the United States. And, the United States might help by sort of losing track of where it's going on the way through. But
Okay, thank you. In looking at the future, so we have other two topics that are combined, according to my opinion. So one is energy. Because we have to take into account what is happening about the energy transition. So on the one hand, probably Trump stopped a little bit, but probably the forecast, so the projection for the future is set, according to my opinion. This is my opinion, but with this, we have to move in this direction. Combined to this, there are critical materials. So
that's right.
And for example, I think also the position of Trump in the agreement that Trump has signed in the last days with Ukraine for critical materials, the idea to move to Groenlandia and so on, to Greenland is it could be in this idea. So which is your opinion about the future? So combined to this, another point is probably that you agree when you have written your book on fragmentation. So it's happening now, no? And I remember that in your book that we discussed last year, we are also observing what is happening now because we have this decoupling between China and US, and probably also this agreement between Ukraine and US is in line of this kind of decoupling. And this is the point.
Well, so if you start with a world that is subject to shocks that are frequent, severe, and so on, pandemics, wars, geopolitical tensions, climate, then you have enough to sort of start to produce underperformance relative to the past in the global economy, and you have enough to produce very large structural change, right? Both driven by, normal incentives that companies and others face. So you see diversification all over the place. And all of that was underway in the post-pandemic period. So you can, in a way, you can think of, the Trump, policies that have just arrived as a kind of continuation of that, a massive increase, in the shocks that will, have to be adapted to and so on. Having said that, just before we get to the question of sustainability, the United States is very large. I mean, it's 25% of the global economy. But I don't think Americans, at least, maybe others do, understand the relative magnitudes here. So the United States, China is a big manufacturing operation. It's 31% of global manufacturing. 15% of their exports go to the United States. The United States, under the Trump administration, taking the Liberation Day tariffs as kind of the starting point. I know we have a pause, but as tariffs, consumers and companies dealing with the domestic market have tariffs on everything from every country in the world, right? Well, the other 75%, that's Europe, the major emerging economies, a few other developed countries and so on, have 75% of the global economy, and they're not going to put tariffs up on each other unless we go down the Smoot-Hawley route from the 1930s, which that's not even remotely likely because everybody understands how much damage that would do. And so there are estimates of this, but the likely biggest negative effect of this is going to be in the United States economy. But it obviously depends on negotiations and what happens in 90 days and all this sort of thing. But the rest of the world is experiencing a shock, but it's not fatal, right?
Yeah.
The financial system's a little bit different. About 40% of global fixed income assets are dollar-denominated American, and about 40% of equities. It's hard to measure these things accurately, but relative to the size of the economy, the United States is more dominant in the financial system than it is on the economic side. And so on that score, we can probably cause more trouble, depending on how the policies go. I think with respect to climate change, the commitment remains quite strong, and we're where we were before. I think you're right to point out that the fact that the Trump administration is unenthusiastic about this is not the whole story, even on the American side, because it is a decentralized system to some extent, and I don't think Trump is going to kind of get California to kind of do something different. To take one example, it's a big state, bigger than lots of countries. But the one thing that is important is that that Trump is the president himself and his administration is extremely uninterested, to put it mildly, in anything multilateral. Right? They pulled out of the World Health Organization. They pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. They're busy pulling back from, and they don't really pay attention to these other entities, at least not so far. Which means, which raises a question, right? In a world in which the United States has decided not to be a sponsor of multilateral agreements and the institutions that manage the day-to-day of global interdependence on an evolving basis, the World Trade Organization, the climate agreements, and so on, then what happens? Now, but you could have a complete breakdown in what economists call a non-cooperative equilibrium. That seems unlikely because the rest of the world looks like it is committed to managing global interdependence well and to multilateralism. That includes Europe, that includes China, it includes, as far as I can see, all of the major, emerging economies in the world, including all of them in Asia. You could have a kind of new Cold War, where everybody's forced to choose. I don't think that's the most likely outcome, mainly because the emerging economies don't want to do that, right? They've been absolutely transparently clear about this. They do not want to choose up sides. They want to have a productive relationship with the United States and Europe, and at least in the Asian economies, they have to have a productive economic relationship with China. It's just too important, and it's difficult and tense. So they have a number of these economies and countries have important economic relationships with China and defense and security arrangements with the United States. And making those things all mesh is not an easy task. But the bottom line is, I think the way the world is going to go, and this is not a sure thing, is that the United States will drop out of the multilateral system as a sponsor for a while, but the rest of the world will come together. And that means Europe is going to have to find a way to get along with China, because those are the two most important entities. And that includes climate change and all the other dimensions of global interdependence. And then the other countries need to kind of sign up for it too. I think that's it's not a sure thing, but the most likely scenario. And if it's done right, then if the United States changes its mind, meaning changes its administration sometime in the future, they can kind of rejoin the party. But I think the world is big enough and wealthy enough and strong enough, resilient enough to be able to manage this even without the United States presence. And I wouldn't have said that. 25 years ago, I would have said the only other place that could sort of carry this forward was Europe. Most of the developing world was in the very low income or very low middle income category. They didn't have anything like the economic size, power, resilience that they have now. So this is a different world than the one we used to have.
Yeah. And I have other two quick questions or two. Sure. The first is related to artificial intelligence. So looking at the future, so we discuss a lot about this. No, we will have to look at what should happen in the future. The idea is if continue to increase in this manner, so it's running. This technology is running. I compare a little bit with the internet, but probably is faster than in internet, and we are using a lot. The idea is, in my mind, is which could be the future. So the idea of the economy in the future, and also because if there is a lot of different jobs that will be replicated by AI, and the value, so the price of this economy will grow to zero. So there was a discussion with our director here in FIMA, in which he arrived with a paper, in which paper is show us that it's possible to write a paper by using AI, or better, AI is able to write a paper, and they have calculated the cost of doing this. It was, $10 for writing a paper with a new, and so he said to us, given that we have, he's joking obviously, but given that we have to pay for your number of papers, so $10, so I have to fire everybody because you're fired. Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the projection is in the future. Okay, which goes to the new job, so this exists, and also the value of the things. Because in my mind, the idea is also the value will decrease a lot of some things, obviously, which could be replicated by. Yep. And this is my idea that you have in mind about this.
Yeah, so I guess I probably spent the lion's share of my time until Trump intruded, trying to think about this carefully. It's such a large subject. I mean, I'll just take a shot at a few things that might be of interest to your stakeholders. I think there's been a shift. First of all, we're on a learning curve, right? So I was talking to a group of labor economists at another institution here in Milan, and they clearly wanted to know how this was going to end up. And I said, that's not a useful research goal, right? And the reason it's not a useful research goal is all those people out there, millions of entities and people, are trying to figure out how to use this to achieve various objectives, whether it's productivity gains or whatever. But they haven't figured it out yet. They're making progress, but they haven't figured it out. The chance you're going to figure it out before they figure it out, because it's what they do, is very low.
Yeah.
So don't, and in addition, the technology is a rapidly moving target. So even if we freeze frame the technology and you are somehow able to figure it out with this batch of technology, it'll be different tomorrow, right? So you have to redo. So for all those reasons, I think the objective should be a little bit more, where are we going? What can we think of directionally? And what do we need to do to steer it in productive directions? In that context, I'll just mention a couple of things. The AI Index, which is published annually by the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Organization at Stanford, documented a couple of things that are really quite interesting this year, just a month ago. One, the costs are coming down. Yeah. This is a bit like the DeepSeek effect. Two, there's a proliferation of small models that are relatively cheap to use. And three, the gap between the United States and China is closing faster than people thought, despite the restrictions on things like the most advanced semiconductor chips. So that, and the open source is growing, which makes it more accessible to a wide range of people. So I don't think the infrastructure, and the energy requirements and all that are sort of irrelevant, because these are pretty big models. And not all of them are Gen AI, by the way. So we have stunning amounts of progress in various areas. The second one is the Human Development Report, which was released last week in Brussels. This is the annual report of the United Nations Development Program. And it's important. This year's on AI. And what this is about is what is it going to take to make AI a strong positive influence on human development. And human development in this context is a kind of multidimensional assessment of well-being, but includes, very importantly, the notion of agency. Agency means you have some degree of control over what you're doing, the environment, etc. So it comes from Amartya Sen got this going many years ago, and it's an important perspective that is a little bit less kind of narrowly economic, a little bit more, are we really going in the direction of human flourishing or not? And there's a human resource index that's published every year that's interesting and a little worrying. We're going to talk about that briefly at the Triennale. So all of that's happening. I would say, if I had to guess, the biggest effects in the short run, that we're going to be able to see are going to come in science. You can see this in biomedical science. The Nobel Prize in chemistry this year was really focused on that. The Nobel Prize in physics was also AI. So that's kind of like 5 out of 2 categories. And the general sense is that, in a whole range of science and applied science, that these are incredibly powerful tools. Now, it's not a done deal. I mean, AlphaFold is a done deal, the prediction of 3-dimensional structure of proteins, but there's just so much activity. But the reason I think it'll come fast there is that in science, if you give the scientists a powerful tool, they just pick up and use it, right? You don't have this complexity of, changing the business models, changing people's behavior, teaching everybody how to use it, that you have in economic processes, economic and business and finance. And so I think the effect will not be small in the world of economics, but it will come with a lag, right? It started, but it will come with a lag. On that score, will it be inclusive? Meaning, will it cover everybody? Will it, James Manika and I have written about this. He's now it used to be McKinsey, and McKinsey Global Institute is now the senior vice president at Google. And his responsibilities include the economic and social impact, but also he has the advanced research reporting to him, so he has a kind of front row seat. And they're a very big part of the basic research. This is basic research, by the way. They published the stuff. The most famous output from that is the 2017 paper, on it, all you need is attention. It's the core of the beginnings of the Gen AI world. So what we would say, I think, and this is right, is we can't just assume this, it'll be inclusive and automatic. We could get divergence. We could get superstar firms running ahead and everybody else kind of lost. We could get sectors running ahead like tech and finance, and other sectors sort of lost somewhere, and lagging. All of which I think means that the policy agenda, which is an evolving one, has to deal not only with downside risks and misuse, but it has to deal with the legitimately public sector interest in the upside potential and making sure it goes. My view is that potential productivity surge is very large, but it is conditional on it spreading throughout the economy, whether you're talking about a domestic economy or the global economy. And so that's where a lot of attention needs to be paid. And nobody has kind of complete answers, but I think the policy discussion, in various places has shifted a little bit from, boy, this is dangerous, to, yeah, it is, misuse, but there's a lot of upside potential. So in this meeting in Paris that, occurred, I don't know, early March, there was a better balanced sort of a sense that the upside potential is, important, and we probably ought to kind of pay attention to that. And we're, the Human Development Report is very much about how are we going to try to make sure this spreads around the world. My joking version of the AI world is that there's more experts on AI now than there are people on the planet. It's a little ridiculous, but there's a reasonable set of people who are involved in it technologically. And then there's a bunch of other people, who have taken the trouble to kind of figure out what they're really doing. And then there's some other people who've sort of read a book. But I think that, the bottom line is, in multiple dimensions of human development, economic performance, there's a huge potential here. So, for example, we could get a productivity surge. This is the best time to have it in aging economies. If you want to lighten the burden on the younger generation, as they have to keep old people like me alive, that would help enormously. If you look at inclusiveness and growth patterns in developing economies, we're using digital and AI in multiple areas to serve people who are either underserved or so remote that you can't serve them, or it's too small, so it's too costly to serve them. So you have a sustainable version of microfinance now. You have profitable, sustainable version of microfinance that's based essentially on AI. In credit, you'll see it in asset management. You see similar things in healthcare. You have take one of the breakthroughs in AI that came before Gen AI was image recognition, object recognition. So that's being used all over the place. But in skin cancer and diabetic retinopathy, you have images that people can produce by themselves. Just take a picture, your cell phone of your eye or your skin, and the AIs are pretty good at detecting potentially problematic things. Now, when I teach about this, I say to the students, okay, so you remember we were talking about the human benchmark? In this case, if the human benchmark is what a top flight dermatologist can do, we haven't passed the human benchmark, unlike in some other areas. And so what do you think? And they say, nice try, didn't make it this time. I say, okay, let's think about this for a minute, right? Why do you say that? And they say, well, I'm going to the dermatologist, right? I don't need the AI, the person's 2 blocks away. I say, that's fine. I say, but 85% of the world's population doesn't live anywhere near a dermatologist. And they go, oh. I say, no, so now what do you think about it? They realize that in terms of preventive primary care, as an early warning system that is not a substitute for a dermatologist, it may cause them to get on the train and spend the money and go 85 kilometers to the nearest, urban center and get themselves checked out. Whereas before, we economists understand this. The incentives are such that you probably wouldn't do that, if you don't have something that influences the conditional probabilities, and so on. I mean, Google has a climate model that's designed to detect very severe climate events.
Yeah.
This model can predict accurately very severe life-threatening climate events in a 5-kilometer radius within a 15-minute window, 12 hours in advance, and the model takes 1 minute to run.
Yeah.
Think about it. I mean, just in terms of saving people's lives. So, this isn't growth, this isn't productivity, this isn't anything, except just saving people's lives. Because they get out of the way in time. And so stuff like that. I mean, I think this is going to come like, a flood, a tsunami at us, and the opportunities are just enormous. Whether the AI is superhuman or just useful, even though it's, doesn't meet the human benchmarks. The other thing that I believe, and you can take it or leave it, but we're not very far away from having everybody on the planet having a digital assistant that's read everything and every language and at some level understood what they're reading. Do I think that's a threat? Am I going to have an AI write a paper? No. But when I want to research something, I have a very pretty powerful entity that can help me find the things I ought to read. I asked Gemini, that's Google's advanced Gen AI model, what the best books on the Italian Renaissance were. Yeah. And it took, a few seconds, it gave me an answer, and then said, do you want, more research done on this? I said, yes. It took about 10 minutes. And it came back with what you just said, a paper. Yeah. And the paper was a pretty, effective 11 pages worth with references to websites that it had consulted and the ones that it hadn't decided not to use. Tour of the literature. Would I decide not to read the literature? No. I mean, if I were a scholar in that field, no. So I think that in education, where, you and I reside, I think the thing we need to do is stop wringing our hands about whether somebody's going to write the paper, that isn't the student, right? And start telling them, look, this is in the category of a very powerful tool that you can use to learn faster. So let's use it that way and use it responsibly. If you use this tool, reference it just the way you reference everything else. It's the honor system. And then people say, well, how are you going to test? And we know that the tech solution to the question, did an AI write this, is not very good, at least not now. But I have a solution to that, which is, suppose, you're a student, and the subject is X, and you've written something, and it's pretty good, but I don't really know whether you really wrote it. So how can I tell whether you've learned the subject matter? And my answer to that question is, we'll get together with no iPhones and no computers, and we'll have a 15-minute conversation, right? Yeah. Now, not all faculty are going to be thrilled about having to do this one-on-one, but that's the answer, right? You and I can tell in 15 minutes if somebody doesn't have a clue, what's going on in this particular subject, right? Yeah. So it's a little bit more labor-intensive, but it's not an impossible problem to solve. So maybe I'm excessively on the optimistic side of the Sergio, but I think if we go down the learning curve, learning how to use this, the potential is very high, and we can avoid the negative side. The head of BCG's X, which is the digital part of BCG, the consulting firm, at this Paris thing, told an interesting story. He said, they have a whole bunch of software engineers because they're building digital products for their clients. We decided to use GitHub, one of the coding AIs. So we gave it to all the software engineers, and we watched for 2 months, and after 2 months the productivity effect was 0. And they sort of said, well, that was a bit surprising. And so he said, so we went and looked. And what was happening is the software engineers were doing what they were doing before, and GitHub was finishing the line of code, like a super version of autocorrect or autocomplete. They said, well, that's not what you're supposed to do with GitHub. It's more in the direction of agentic AI. You tell it what you want, and it writes the first draft, and then you look at it and fix it. So they got coaches for the software engineers, he said. I'm just reporting what he said. And the coaches told them, let's use it this way, not that way. And then the productivity effect was, pretty large. So there's a learning curve for kind of everybody on this. And it's not surprising, it's bewildering, but it's kind of fun.